Welcome to the world of Regency, England, where a good marriage and a spotless reputation are your keys to survival. Our headstrong heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, may be spotless, but she'll marry when she's good and ready. Meanwhile, her mother is on a mission to find rich husbands for each of her 5 daughters. The future of the Bennet family may depend on it. At the moment, Mrs. Bennet has the new bachelor in town, Mr. Bingley, in her crosshairs. She's worried he's going to get nabbed by another family, which would be a disaster. Luckily, the local Meryton ball is coming up, a perfect opportunity for Mrs. Bennet to show off her daughters. On the night, Mr. Bingley arrives with his sisters, his brother-in-law, and a friend, the tall, handsome, single and filthy rich Mr. Darcy. Unfortunately, Mr. Darcy is super rude and manages to insult Elizabeth. Ouch. But at least Bingley and Jane hit it off. Hey team, just a reminder, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel out, and our next upload could be on something taught in your next class. Thanks, and back to the video. Thus, the Bingleys and Bennets embark on a series of visits that bring Jane and Mr. Bingley ever closer. Meanwhile, a change comes over Mr. Darcy. He starts crushing on Elizabeth. Not that she's aware, nor does she care. Mr. Darcy confesses his crush to Miss Caroline Bingley, which inflames her jealousy. When Jane goes for dinner at Netherfield, the Bingleys' estate, she falls ill and is forced to stay there. Elizabeth rushes over to be by her sister's side. This incident brings Jane and Bingley even closer, and it also causes Mr. Darcy's feelings for Elizabeth to deepen. But Elizabeth is oblivious to Mr. Darcy's agony. After Jane recovers and both Bennet girls return to Longbourn, their father receives a letter from his cousin, Mr. Collins. He's the male relative who'll inherit Longbourn after Mr. Bennet's death. So Mr. Collins isn't exactly welcome, but he wants to visit, and it would be rude to refuse him. When Mr. Collins arrives, he hints that he's willing to marry one of the Bennet girls to ease the inheritance situation. No thanks. Then there's his constant bragging about his connection to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, his wealthy patroness. Could he be cringier? Yes, because he soon sets his sights on Elizabeth as a potential bride. But Elizabeth is busy making the acquaintance of someone else, the handsome Mr. Wickham. He's a soldier currently stationed in Meryton. Interestingly, he seems to have a rocky history with Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth gets to know Mr. Wickham over dinner at her aunt's house. He explains that he and Mr. Darcy basically grew up together. But when Mr. Darcy's father passed away and left Mr. Wickham an inheritance, Mr. Darcy allegedly cheated him out of it. What a scoundrel! When the Bingleys host a lavish ball at Netherfield, Elizabeth is keen to dance with Mr. Wickham. But he doesn't show up. So Lizzie endures Mr. Collins' attentions and faces off with Mr. Darcy about his treatment of Wickham. The evening worsens as Mrs. Bennet behaves embarrassingly at dinner, and Mary sings like a dying cat at the piano. The next day, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. When she refuses, both he and Mrs. Bennet are astonished by Elizabeth's rejection. Mrs. Bennet tries to get Mr. Bennet to intervene, but he won't force his favourite daughter to marry a goose like Mr. Collins. The atmosphere at Longbourn is toxic until Mr. Collins shifts his sights onto Elizabeth's neighbour and friend, Charlotte Lucas. When Elizabeth meets Wickham again in town, He explains away his no-show at Netherfield Ball and walks the Bennet girls home. Elizabeth then introduces him to her parents. Is she catching feelings? Poor Jane then receives a letter from Caroline Bingley. Everyone at Netherfield has gone to London. The Bingley sisters also hope that their brother will propose to Mr Darcy's sister, Georgiana. This is bitterly disappointing for Jane. Mr Bingley's love seemed so genuine. Maybe there's still hope? Soon enough, Mr Collins proposes to Charlotte Lucas, and she accepts. She explains to Elizabeth that it's a practical match. Security is more important than romance. Mrs Bennet takes the news pretty hard, though. Then it's more bad news for Jane. The Bingleys will stay in London for the winter. Elizabeth is furious. Gentle Jane didn't deserve this heartbreak. Bingley's wicked sisters must be behind it. Meanwhile, Mr Wickham is still paying Elizabeth lots of attention. Mr Bennet even teases her over it. Christmas approaches, and the beloved Gardiners arrive from London to stay at Longbourn. Mr Gardiner is Mrs Bennet's brother, and Mrs Gardiner is Jane and Elizabeth's favourite aunt. Mrs Gardiner suggests that Jane return with them to London for a much-needed break. She also gives Elizabeth a gentle warning about Wickham. He's broke, so watch out. After Christmas, Jane returns to London with the Gardiners, and Charlotte Lucas marries Mr Collins. The newlyweds then head off to live at Hunsford Parsonage in Kent. Jane writes from London to say that she's caught up with Caroline Bingley. But the visits were brief, and Miss Bingley was stone cold. It really is over with the Bingleys. In other news, Mr Wickham has zeroed in on another local heiress named Miss King. It's a minor blow to Elizabeth's ego, but no big deal. Good luck to them. With the arrival of spring, Elizabeth goes to visit Charlotte at Hunsford Parsonage. On the way, she swings by London to check on Jane, who's slowly recovering from her heartbreak. During her stay in Kent, Elizabeth tolerates Mr Collins because Charlotte seems content with her new life. Elizabeth also meets Mr Collins' wealthy patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She's probably the biggest snob in England, but Elizabeth stands firm. It's also amusing how Lady Catherine intends for her nephew, Mr Darcy, to marry her sickly daughter, Anne. What an adorable couple they'll make. Speak of the devil, Mr Darcy then comes to stay with his aunt at Rosings, her lavish estate. He's accompanied by his charming cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. When the two gentlemen visit Hunsford, Mr Darcy is quite reserved around Elizabeth, but then he starts showing up on her walks. What's he playing at? Elizabeth also bumps into Colonel Fitzwilliam, who lets slip that Mr Darcy recently saved his friend, Mr Bingley, from an unwise engagement. He doesn't realise that he's talking about Liz's sister, Jane. Elizabeth sees red. Darcy broke up Jane and Bingley. So, when Mr Darcy finally declares his love to Elizabeth and proposes marriage, she tears strips off him and sends him packing. The next day, Mr Darcy hands Elizabeth a letter that explains two important things. Firstly, that he talked Bingley out of proposing to Jane because her reserved manner made it seem as though she had no feelings for Bingley. The other issue was the ill-mannered behaviour of Mrs Bennet and the younger Bennet girls. Mr Darcy never meant to hurt Jane, he was only looking out for his friend. The second thing is about Wickham. Mr Darcy gave Wickham his inheritance money, but he wasted it. Then, when he asked for more, Darcy refused. So Wickham tried to elope with Darcy's sister, Georgiana, who has a fortune of £30,000. Luckily, Georgiana fessed up, and Mr Darcy managed to save her and her money from Wickham's clutches. If Elizabeth doesn't believe him, she can ask Colonel Fitzwilliam. After a lot of stewing, Elizabeth finally admits to herself that she believes Mr Darcy. She feels bad for being so nasty to him, but stands by her decision to refuse his proposal. Hopefully, she'll never see him again. Elizabeth soon leaves Hunsford and catches up with Jane in London. She decides not to spill any of the tea from the past few weeks. Not yet, anyway. Jane and Elizabeth then head back to Longbourn and are met on the way by Kitty and Lydia. They have tea. Wickham has split with Miss King and Lydia is ecstatic about it. Uh-oh. Thankfully, Wickham's regiment are leaving for Brighton soon, so they can all forget about him. Back at Longbourn, Liz finally tells Jane about Mr Darcy's proposal and the shocking truth about Wickham. She's careful, however, not to say anything about Darcy's death blow to Jane and Bingley's love story. The next thing they know, Lydia is invited to Brighton by Mrs Forster, the Colonel's wife. It'll be soldiers galore, and Elizabeth foresees that Lydia will disgrace herself. Still, Mr and Mrs Bennet let her go. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth goes on a summer holiday with the Gardiners to Derbyshire. This is lovely, except that Mr Darcy lives in Derbyshire. And since Pemberley, his grand estate, is famous for its natural beauty, Mrs Gardiner simply must have a tour. Luckily, Mr Darcy won't be at home, so there's no chance of an awkward encounter. Actually, there's every chance, because while the trio are being shown around, Mr Darcy rocks up unexpectedly. He joins them on their walk and is actually rather charming. He even asks Elizabeth if he can introduce her to Georgiana. Over the next few days, Elizabeth continues to socialise with Mr Darcy and allows warm feelings to grow. Could it be love? But then, a family crisis ruins everything. Lydia has run away with Wickham. In a panic, Elizabeth tells Mr Darcy what's happened, then scoots back to Longbourn with the Gardiners. Elizabeth arrives home to face the chaos, while Mr Gardiner heads to London to help Mr Bennet look for the fugitive lovers. Meanwhile, rumours of the scandal spread far and wide, and details emerge about Wickham's crippling debts. When Mr Bennet finally returns home, he's empty-handed and full of regret. Hope returns when Mr Gardiner reports that he's found Lydia. He's finalising the terms of her marriage to Wickham, which includes paying off that scumbag's debts. Mr Gardiner has saved the day, but how will the Bennets ever repay him? Thus, the wedding takes place. Lydia becomes Mrs Wickham, and the newlyweds soon visit Longbourn. They act as though nothing dodgy ever happened. Elizabeth can see that Wickham isn't that into Lydia, but she's crazy about him. In her enthusiasm to boast about her wedding, Lydia lets slip that Mr Darcy was there. Wait, what? Elizabeth writes to Mrs Gardiner, who reveals that, yes, Mr Darcy is the real hero. He found the pair hiding out in London, and he settled Wickham's debts and made sure the wedding took place. Except Mr Darcy's involvement was supposed to be a secret. Elizabeth now regrets every harsh word she ever said to him. After the Wickhams leave to begin their new life in northern England, more good news arrives. Mr Bingley is returning to Netherfield, and it's not long before he visits Longbourn with a friend in tow, Mr Darcy. Thus, Bingley reignites the old flame with Jane, and Mrs Bennet can hardly believe her luck. Meanwhile, Mr Darcy barely says a word to anyone before heading back to London. Thankfully, Bingley stays on and finally proposes to Jane, whom he loved all along. Hooray! About a week later, Lady Catherine de Bourgh arrives at Longbourn like a storm cloud. She scolds Elizabeth for trying to snatch her beloved nephew, Mr Darcy, away from her daughter Anne. Elizabeth withstands the onslaught and confirms that she isn't engaged to Mr Darcy. However, she also declares that if Mr Darcy proposed, she's free to accept him. So there. However, rumours persist, and Mr Collins writes to Mr Bennet, warning him to forbid a match between Elizabeth and Mr Darcy. But Mr Bennet thinks this is hilarious. Elizabeth wouldn't marry Mr Darcy if he were the last man on earth, right? Soon after this, Bingley brings Mr Darcy back to Longbourn. While out on a walk, Elizabeth finds a moment to thank Mr Darcy for saving Lydia. This encourages Mr Darcy to finally express his love for Elizabeth, and she does the same. It's now time for them to put all their regrets aside and look forward to a happy future together. Their engagement comes as a shock to everyone, especially Mr Bennet, who thought Elizabeth despised Mr Darcy. When her mother hears about it, she's totally speechless. That's a first. Thus, the future of the Bennet family looks extremely bright, and everyone celebrates Elizabeth and Jane's good fortune. Except Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Caroline Bingley. It takes them a while to accept their new family arrangements. Oh, and there's also Lydia and Wickham, who struggle in every way. But that's what happens when you're guided by lust instead of love and logic. This brings us to the end of Pride and Prejudice, and for our heroine, it's all about peace and prosperity from here on in. Cheers to that! We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.